about bridging or balancing fair data with the privacy and sensitivity of information that we have to deal with in health research. I'm just going to try to share one more time, so apologies for that.
That's okay.
Screen 2, share, and hopefully you'll see Townsville branded.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you
Perfect.
very much. So yeah, thank you again for the introduction. I've got a brief introduction of myself. So I run the research data laboratory up in the Townsville University Hospital. My team is responsible for releasing information to researchers and quality audit officers. I work very closely with the HREC team and also being a HREC member myself. Heavy data background. So, quick agenda for today. I would like to define FAIR and how that relates to digital health research and why it's important. I'm going to go straight into some ethical considerations that we as ethic members have to make per the national statement, and then how that is at odds with some of the privacy governance. I'm not going to put a governance lens on today's presentation, but mainly just discuss some of that conflict that we do see and how we as a HREC could assist our researchers and potentially show a solution that might help us. Now, there's limitations to the solution. I'll go through that as well, but hopefully it's something we can walk away with today as something we can progress institutionally. So I want to discuss the concept of closed versus controlled access, and then we'll go straight into a Q&A. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, but I'll quickly go through this again. So the FAIR principles is looking at 4 key aspects, starting with findable. We talk about how research data can easily be found. Now, doesn't mean access to the data, but a methodology for us to search for already collected, used, produced data sets. There's a lot of work in this space where there's repositories and something like the DOI that helps us catalog what's available and what people are working on. With that findable information, how is that data designed? Was the metadata in our scope would usually mean a data dictionary? How is the data defined? And then we move straight into accessible. So how do we access the data? How do we download the data? And as research and as an institution, how do we control who has access and for what purpose? So these are key aspects of accessibility and being able to allow others to have access to that information. One that really struggle with in healthcare is interoperability. So how do we make data that we've created in our institution or in our area easily shareable or integratable with other areas? It could be as simple as one health service to another health service, but from our perspective at HREC, how can we assist our researchers creating a data set, be it for a trial, collection, or retrospective study, where they can easily share that with another system? A practical example we have is registries, where we might have a registry started at a health service level. They start a national one, but that integration between the two doesn't quite work. Talking about common formats and standards of definitions. And then lastly, probably the biggest one for ethical research and research reproducibility is how can we reuse the data we've already collected? So in my background, I do a lot of work with sepsis. We collected a significant amount of information for that. And basically, I can't share it, which is, disappointing, because it would be a net benefit to society if I can share my information more easily and reuse that data between other experts that might be looking at that problem a different lens. My lens is very specific to a retrospective AI, but there might be there is certainly other methods we can reuse that data. So I would like this to be the vision. This is where we want to be, Nevada, if we will. However, there's obviously some issues with that. However, to support that vision, as ethics members, we do have ethical considerations, especially under Section 3, Element 4, which outlines the collection, use, and management of data information. That whole element subsection describes how we should assess the management of data in an ethical capacity. Specifically, I want to point to 3.1.49 that talks about reusability. So we have the consideration we have to make on, the data research should be made accessible, but can we? I think is where we kind of struggle with. I'm going to get that in a second. And that struggle starts with the fact that we want to be, accessible. We want to be open. However, as we know, with sensitive information, we have to be very clear on what those risks are to our patients, our fellow cohort, before we release that. So if we have the ethical consideration to be open and accessible for us to review, and we have a very clear framework of what that open data set should look like from a framework perspective, being the FAIR principles, why can't we just open it all? If someone comes to us and says, yep, I followed the FAIR principles, my data is open, my data is accessible, everyone can just use it, great. But per our considerations, we also have to look at the risk, and is that proportional? And one of the risks that we have to consider is the Privacy Act. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into governance, but we do have to consider, per the national statement, does any law block us from doing something? I believe what's happening is we might be a little bit too conservative, where we're basically saying no. And that's a fair starting point. And hopefully today I can give something where we can meet in the middle. So in the privacy principles, we obviously got your storage and security requirements. This is quite standard. Who has access? Why do I have access? Where does it belong? Who's it storing? Where's it being stored? We look at then from that storage or that bucket where you put that information in, who has access, who's being disclosed that information, how's it being disclosed? Critically, under our use and disclosure, we have to look at consent and legal authority. Obviously, consent trumps, but when we look at waiver of consent per the national statement, we then also have to look at the legal aspect of being able to release under waiver of consent, which the Health Board Act or the Public Health Act for most jurisdictions. And then lastly, we have to look at our data security itself. So separate to the storage, we're now looking specifically on what steps we take to make sure that ongoing security is always there for that information. So there's a lot to consider for the researcher, right? And also for the ethics committee. So we have all of these legal elements we have to consider to make sure that the data is private and secure, but we also want to be fair, right? So what I would like to outline is basically this dichotomy of where we currently are enclosed, because that's the most secure, and saying, no, we're not going to share, and the vision of full open fair data, and what can we do potentially in the middle. I think for today, I'm going to steer clear from going full open. I think that's a much bigger conversation. I just want to show a bit of a pathway of going into this controlled middle ground access and a potential technical solution that could help us get there with that. So for open, we want full discoverable metadata. So your data dictionary is available to anyone. Data is accessible and it can just be downloaded. Think mimic data sets for all of my technical people out there who likes to use open data. Mimic is a very good example of this. And open, we usually want that to be non-sensitive because it can be downloaded by anyone without any review. So we want to make that non-sensitive for the project that we've completed. Currently, what's happening on average, or most of the time, from my perspective and talking to fellow researchers, so we don't make the data dictionary public, even though there's no legal issue with making metadata available. That could just be an education piece. The data that we do collect, we don't make available or discoverable because we're worried it might breach. And then because of that, we kind of squirrel away, but we don't de-identify either. It just sits there, sensitive data in a pool, basically. So for today, I want to look at metadata still discoverable. We still allow people to see because there's no private information in that. What does data access look like via data custodian or via the project? I think for this discussion, data custodian would be potentially the PI, whoever the lead project is. And then sensitive data from completed projects and what that sensitive data might look like, right? And this is basically the resulting tension that I would like to outline. So we have FAIR principles on the left, and we have the privacy that we need to meet on the right. And I'm trying to kind of find a middle ground today. Okay, so before I continue, this potential solution for this middle ground I'm going to pitch today basically is the use of a common data model. Now, this isn't the only solution. This is just a potential way forward. And this is something that the Research Data Laboratory is actively developing within the lab for research use. And I'm going to, at the end, explain why we're tightly coupling this work with our ethics committee and having them on the journey, because it's not just a pure governance matter, in my opinion. Okay, so before I continue, let's just quickly define what a CDM is, or Common Data Model. Basically, if you can imagine, it's a standard set of instructions of what your health data should look like. It's set to be agnostic to systems. It's set to be abstract from workflow. It is a set of recipes, if you will, to define clinical, in our sense, and I'll give an example in a second, of concepts. So be it measurements, be it admission, patient information, so on. That's useful for us as research. Again, I'm going to talk about digital health. You can have common data models for other areas as well. So yep, standard definition and clear rules for transformation. Clear rules, that's really important. As we're making all these transformations to be more fair, how do we ensure that we track all that all the way through? So imagine there's a shared data language between projects, institutions, wherever, and the same terms mean exactly the same thing, which is really important as well. Lastly, we also incorporate patient privacy right into the design. So clear example of this from a clinical context is something called OMOP. And this is used by institutions worldwide, mainly in Europe and the US. And it transforms the localized data into a standard format that's internationally usable, because it's international definition. Like, as I said, mainly the EU and US at the moment. Australia is slowly implementing, and New Zealand as well. This empowers our researchers to basically incorporate the FAIR principles, but still meet their obligations. Okay, so well, how do we do that? So as I just said, we can empower our researchers, but how does it actually work? So if we look at the elements that we look for FAIR, we've got discoverable. So it's a standardized data dictionary that's defined by the International Committee. We can publish that. There's no legal issue of us publishing. There's no sensitive information into that. We have clear documentation, also supported by that same committee, that we can publish. But the institutional control of what system and how it's defined is still there. We can make that data easily accessible with defined process procedures of what specific data set within the definition is available. So for example, we can say, well, no, you can't have the personalized sensitive information, but you can have every medication order that has no linkage to a patient. It's just pure medication orders. You can break all that down of what accessibility level is required by whom for what purpose. You can have standardized governance because it's all defined, and you can have built-in privacy protections as well. Again, talking about sensitivity, a big issue that I find is people will say in their ethics application, we're de-identifying our data. They don't say how. This is a clear management way. It's a clear way for us to manage that process where we can clearly define this is the sensitive information in our model. This is what it will look like de-identified, because we're removing, aggregating, changing these elements within the standard model to then present to an outside party or whatever we need to do. We have validated transformation. So all the transformations for OMOP is publicly available on GitHub per the previous presentations, which is really good to see. So OMOP does the same thing. All those transformations and lineage you can see as you transform the data throughout. Okay. So as a HREC committee, we need to review data protection, access controls, and future use. So if we have these key questions from that section 3 element 4, collection, use, and management of data. And these are basically the key questions we have to look at from a FAIR principles perspective. How do we couple in OMOP? So we've got data protection, talking about personal identifiers being separated. A standardized vocab for our mapping removes that institutional direct linkage. And also we got built-in data checks and validation procedures built by international community for clinical purpose. So it's got that clear purpose as well. We have clear access controls of who has access to what bit of information, who are the stewards, and who to contact. So clear methods of data access. And we also have that future use of data lineage and how to collaborate with our researchers. So it's just that step forward. I will say this framework doesn't put us into that open just yet, but I do believe we have a step into that middle ground to start off with. Considerations, technical. It is a technical piece of work, and this is why we're working with, so my team's very technical, we're working with our HREC to deliver the technical aspects of this. There is a bit of technical investment required from an institutional or from a project perspective. And just to be clear, I have seen projects stand up OMOP delivery because they have a multi-year, multi-site trial, and they want to be able to share that on internationally. So they will collect internally very specific bits of data and then model that into OMOP to then share on with the US, for example. Because it's OMOP and for all those benefits I showed before, it's also HIPAA compliant. As long as you tick, removal of identifiers and a few other things that they require, you can send it on to the US as well. Governance, you still need a robust governance procedure. Who does what, when, and why, and making sure you're meeting your regulatory requirements. And institutional, you need resources, you need the cross-team collaboration, you need a long-term commitment. So for today, I want to highlight that CDM is just another tool. It's not a complete solution. It doesn't bridge all of the issues that we face between wanting to have open data and privacy principles. But I believe that if we look at CDM development in collaboration with the technical teams and the ethics team, which I think is really, really important, we can then create a data set that meets a lot of our ethical requirements. But I do want to highlight, I believe what's happening, a lot of institutions is doing this without the ethics a group. And one benefit of my team is that I'm also in the ethics committee. So we have that ethical oversight or ethics committee oversight, as well as the governance from a privacy perspective to really meet that bridge. I think that's really, really critical. Yeah, so that's me. I'm not sure if I went over time then. So I want to say thank you. And is any other questions for me before I on?
Rudolf, if I was really good, I'd tell you if you're over time or not, but because we've mixed the order of things around, I'm not too sure. No, I think you're doing pretty well, actually. That was really interesting. I'm just going to read out one of the comments in the chat from Susan, who said that the FAIR principles were developed for the sharing of research data produced from completed science research studies, such as in geology, not developed considering the special context of, now I've just lost that, of healthcare for the secondary use of real-world clinical data. It would be helpful to have additional principles added to FAIR which would explicitly include the points brought up in the previous speakers, such as trust, ethics, reciprocity, and everything.
Yeah, completely agree.
To guide.
Yeah. I don't have anything to really answer there, except that I agree. I believe FAIR should be extended, much like we do with, other evaluation frameworks like Tripod or other areas where we keep extending it for very specific use cases. I completely agree. FAIR principles should be extended. I guess what I was trying to show is that the high level abstracted spirit of FAIR, if you will, I do believe is important to health research for reproducibility, which is a big issue in health research. And that gives us a starting point. However, if that's like I said, if that's the vision, that's where we want to be, even getting to that without the extension is tricky. Now, what could be beneficial if we extend FAIR to bring it back a little and see what that middle ground looks like. Basically, that middle that I showed, is that the extension then? That could be a solution. Yeah.
And Robert said, assuming that this data transformation is all compliant with GDPR?
Oh, that's a good question. So the EU extension, I do believe they've done a lot of work with that piece. I might have to get back to you on that one. I don't have a lot of experience with European law. Yeah, the EU is all about OMOP and CDM at the moment. So I'm gonna say yes. The reason I say that, I know that I'm off by heart, is probably the biggest consumer and producer of OMOP models is the NHS. So they had the issue of FAIR principles, but multiple jurisdictions. So Scotland versus England versus Wales versus Northern Ireland, they had a lot of governance issues just in their own NHS, right? So they wanted to be fair kind of internally, if that makes sense. So what they've done is they've done a lot of investment for all of these health services within each jurisdiction, having their own OMOPs they can share in between. Now what they've done recently is now they're sharing all that information into research institutes because it's all been, it's all fair. It's basically that middle bubble that I spoke about. So you can now share in between institutions and health services for secondary purposes, which is really important. So that's probably the biggest driver for OMOP, along with US entities as well.
Yeah. Okay, there are a couple of more questions in that in either the chat or the Q&A, which I might leave that for you to go to directly. We just want to give people a bit of a break. So Claire's talk is, we do have that as a recording. We're not going to play it right now, just because it's such a full day today, and we think, taking in these amazingly good presentations, and we just need to give people a bit of a break before their next session starts. So thanks, Rudolf, and all of the speakers this morning. They're really, really interesting. Hopefully I've going to be able to take that all in, and I think most of these presentations are available, so we can go back over them, and I can stop coming out to my team and asking too many questions from them. Matilda has noted that because of her work hasn't been published, if you've got any particular questions, if you can maybe contact her directly. It's not something that she can really put up in the chat or anything.